Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Thank you all for your willingness to serve or prior service to our country. Mr. Roebuck, the bulk of my questions and the time I have will be towards you just simply because of my interest in Bahrain and what's occurring there. You may have answered this already. I may have missed it, so I may be restating it, but I want to talk about the expulsion of Tom Malinowski, ostensibly for holding a meeting with the WEFAC representatives without a government representative present. My understanding is the government also reportedly barred a member of Congress in the last few weeks from visiting the country based on a similar concern. Even when, as I anticipate you will be, you are confirmed as ambassador to the United States, do you plan to comply with this requirement that they have a government representative anytime we meet with members of an opposition party?
No, sir, Senator Rubio. We've made it clear to the Bahraini government that this is an unacceptable condition. It's not only unacceptable in Bahrain, it's worldwide. There are established diplomatic protocols for such meetings, and we use those types of, we expect compliance with those types of international norms in our meetings worldwide, and that goes for Bahrain also.
Well, there's an invitation out to Mr. Malinowski to return to the kingdom. Do you know what's the status of that, and have they set any ground rules, quote unquote, for his return, for him to be able to come back?
Senator, I spoke with Assistant Secretary Malinowski late last week about this. He wants to return at a time that would be most helpful to the broader political dialogue and reconciliation process. We have discussed this at senior levels with the Bahraini government. They've indicated they would welcome him back. They understand the need for corrective steps to address the previous expulsion, and we will continue to work through this issue to try to resolve it. But the conditions that you cite would not be acceptable for a return visit, and that has been part of the broader conversation.
Now, I want to get a little broader on this, and I think some of the questions around here have touched upon it, because Bahrain is a nation that I've taken an interest in a couple years ago for reasons of both human rights and geopolitical reality. And you know, I believe human rights should always be at the forefront of what we do from a national security perspective and from a foreign policy perspective. And so I was deeply concerned to see that a minority in that country felt oppressed and felt like they didn't have the space to speak out in the kingdom. And we engaged ourselves early in that conversation. In fact, met with some young people from there that expressed to us that their desire was not to overthrow the kingdom, but simply to create a political accommodation where they had a greater role and more of a voice. As that process has broken down over the last few years, you've begun to see evidence or indications that the opposition in the country has become increasingly, potentially more radicalized, or at least elements of it thereof have become more radicalized, and that potentially have created stronger links with Iran as their sponsor in these efforts. The answer we always get back whenever we express our desire to speak forcefully on these issues of human rights is, we have to be careful not to go too far on human rights, I'm told, because Bahrain is such a critical importance to the United States from a geopolitical perspective that somehow we need to push aside the human rights considerations because they are such an important partner in that region from a defense perspective. I think that's troubling and short-sighted for a couple of reasons. One, I think it undermines our credibility when we go around the world talking about how we are fighters on behalf of human rights and democracy, freedom, and the liberty of all people, and on the other hand, we are willing or appear willing to tolerate it in some parts of the world because they're good partners. We did that in the Cold War as well in many instances, and I don't criticize it now, and hindsight is always 20/20, but it was to some, we still in some extent pay the price for that in some parts of the world. The other is, I think, it's actually bad for our allies, because when they do this, when you have a large number of people in this country, in this instance, not even a minority, I called it a minority, it's not a minority, but a group that feels being oppressed because they don't have a voice, I think long-term that's unsustainable. If you're an ally of the United States, what we should be explaining to these countries, and I hope that we are, is what you have today is an unsustainable position. You've got to create space for every segment of your society to be involved. Otherwise, you've put yourself in an unsustainable long-term position that actually is ripe for the sorts of instability that don't just undermine you, but ultimately undermine our standing in that part of the world. But again, the argument I get back is we got to be careful not to push too hard because Bahrain is too important. I will say that in 2013, a former director of national intelligence, Dennis Blair, said, this is a quote, "Bahrain needs the United States from both the security and economic points of view more than the United States needs Bahrain." He went on to say the Fifth Fleet headquarters should be moved back on board a flagship, as it was until 1993. Permanent basing in a repressive Bahrain undermines our support for reform and is vulnerable if instability continues, unquote. So I guess my point is, as you walk into this role there, what is your view of this balance, to the extent there needs to be a balance, and how would you, and furthermore, how would you evaluate our alternatives for the Naval Support Activity facility in Bahrain? How crucial is that facility? How crucial is that facility being stationed in that place, in Bahrain? How crucial is that to U.S. defense strategy in the Persian Gulf region? But the first one's the most important. How do you view that balance? Because I'm not even sure there should be a balance, per se. I think all of our national security and foreign policy credibility is undermined when we are seen to be the sponsor of and looking the other way to repression.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. I believe there does need to be a balance. I think that a country that promotes and protects human rights will be ultimately a more stable country and can be a more effective security partner. My commitment is to make the case publicly and privately, if confirmed, to the Bahrain government that it's in their long-term interest to promote and protect human rights, and also to support a vibrant political dialogue, reform, and reconciliation process. My view, and I think our policy is informed by this view, is that these two objectives, security partnership and human rights, are not in conflict, but that they mutually reinforce each other. I think it takes work to make sure that the policy functions in that way, but I do believe that that is a fundamental understanding of our policies towards Bahrain. I do think that the hosting of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, is incredibly important to our regional interest. That deepwater port central location allows us to cover 2.3 million square miles of critical oceans and seas, demonstrate resolve to Iran, ensure the free flow of oil and commerce, and mount counterterrorism, counter-piracy, counter-narcotics efforts. So yes, it's critical, but I believe we can balance that interest with our concern for human rights, and it's absolutely essential that we do so. Thank you, sir.
Can I just
Please continue.
Here was what I would just say. When you go to that part of the world, or you speak to people and say, well, why is the United States involved, and why do we care about what's happening in different parts of the world? One of the things we always should lead with is, well, we care about human rights. There are certain realities. I mean, this nation was founded on the principle that all human beings were created equal, endowed by a creator with certain rights that belong to them, that are not granted to them by government. These are the founding principles of our nation. And I think we've been a beacon to the world for over 240 years because we've been willing to go around the world and help those who aspire to that for themselves. It gives credibility to, and standing, and makes us more than just a geopolitical player. It makes us, in essence, someone that other countries look at as an inspiration. Here's where we run into trouble. When you go to these parts of the world and say, well, you care about human rights, and you care about democracy, and you care about freedom, unless it's some country that is critically important to you in some way, then you're willing to look the other way. I mean, you look the other way in Saudi Arabia, where there are no human rights per se, where women aren't even allowed to drive a car. You look the other way in Bahrain, and I've had these conversations where they're, where I've explained to Bahraini officials that it is critical that the space be created because what they have long-term is a powder keg. People aren't all of a sudden just going to decide to take it. This will continue to be a problem and an unsustainable one. And I look at other examples where over time we were able to convince allies of ours in a different era, the Philippines comes to mind, where slowly but surely we pressured and put, during the Reagan administration, created conditions where eventually that dictatorship fell and transitioned to a democracy, albeit one that has some challenges, but certainly no longer governed by a dictator, as an example of a role the U.S. should also play. If we are truly someone's ally, I think it's critical for us to explain and be forceful in continuing to nudge them towards a sustainable position that honors both human rights and democracy and doesn't cost us our credibility. Because I think when we look the other way, whether it's Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, or anywhere else, and say, we care about human rights, unless we happen to have bases in your country and you're helping us achieve some other foreign policy objective, I actually think that threatens and undermines our credibility, our standing, and ultimately those countries as well. So as their allies, I think it's important that we continue to be forceful in explaining to them that if they don't create these spaces where people can become legitimate and open and free parts of that society, where they feel like they have an outlet and a voice in the politics of those nations, those countries are in an unsustainable place and ultimately are going to continue to be places where Iran and others can come in and try to exploit that division. So I hope you'll use this post as an opportunity to continue to further that dialogue and continue to nudge them in that direction. Otherwise, the situation they find themselves in is unsustainable, and I think Bahrain will continue to be susceptible to Iranian influence, trying to stir up Shia militants and others to take actions against the kingdom. So, thank you.